Oda, your microphone is on. It's my sister. uh Zoe, she's the major cook. If you wanna get cooking in terms of the malube, and she's an expert in Syrian dishes as well. But oh, hello. And there's yeah, oh wow, my favorite student. That's Hamza. Hello, Hamza. Welcome. Yeah, that's my nephew. That's the second talk he's attended at University of San Diego. He came to the talk on Iraq I gave in 2023. And Hamza is an important figure because he does a lot to undermine the myth of the Sunni Shia divide. That little kid there is a sushi. He's a Sunni Shia, and yeah, if you could see how when that sectarian divide is overcome, the beautiful products that emerge. That's the best lesson I could give you about the Middle East, is that you're going to be hearing this term over and over again. But without any further ado, let's go ahead and start. Okay. Oh no. How does this happen? Does anyone, sorry, can I get an IT geek who could help me get out of this? There is a mode of PowerPoint that we got out of, but then how do I get out of presenter view? Does anyone know? Go outside and ask the fellow there. He should help me get out of presenter view. Let me stop recording. Just. This one does. Okay. No, yeah, so it's doing it again. Could you? And I forgot, you showed me how to get out of it and I forgot already. Okay, it's good. Some people are still coming in, so that's. Those dots, hide presenter view. Okay, excellent. All right. Excellent. Well, some of you are going to miss this tradition. So here we go for a good number of us. This is our last class. Oh, thank you. Oh, I'm doing the little heart for you. Thank you for that. Well, of course, for those of you, thank you for joining. Normally, I would have my regional security class, and regional security this semester at the Masters in International Relation has been an interesting experiment. I came in with a prepared syllabus, and then every class, literally a major event happened in the Middle East where I had to throw out my prepared lesson. And sure enough, the events on Saturday have continued this tradition. So this is my regional security class, as well as for those of you traveling with Professor Willoughby and I to Spain. This is a combination on the similarities. And now what I'm doing is taking some artistic similarities between the Spanish Civil War and the Syrian Civil War. I want to thank Emily for creating this design for me. Emily Carr, that is. And I want to thank not only the Department of Political Science and International Relations, but the Kroc School for agreeing to sponsoring this, as well as the Humanities Center at USD. So without further ado, okay. This is I'm comparing the first design to another one made in year 8 of the Syrian civil war. This is a lecture on what has it been like to lecture about this conflict since 2011. It's not only a story of the Syrian civil war, it is also somewhat pedagogical in terms of how have I been teaching about this conflict. The point of this lecture is to acknowledge some people that I've been teaching about for the last decade and where I wonder where they are. It was at John Cabot University, and some of you I know have studied abroad there, Callie. And for those of you who don't know, I highly recommend you go to John Cabot University. I was the one who started the exchange with the University of San Diego. When I was teaching there, I said, there's this beautiful campus on the hill of San Diego. You have to set up an exchange with them. Back then, it was the Syrian Civil War, year 8. This was back in 2019. And I picked an image of the Umayyad Mosque. And right next to it, I couldn't have planned it perfectly. There was a requiem for the Mediterranean, the memories of the victims of the sea, referring to the Mediterranean Sea. And I'll be talking about these victims as well. I begin with this. For those of us going to Spain, it's only a 2-hour high-speed railroad to Cordoba. And in Cordoba, you will be seeing a mosque that is now a hybrid cathedral with this alternating white and red design. The Umayyad Mosque in Cordoba refers to a dynasty that used to rule in Syria. There is a mosque of theirs in Cordoba. There's a mosque of theirs in Damascus. There's a mosque of theirs in Aleppo. The Aleppo mosque its minaret was destroyed in 2013, only to be rebuilt about a few weeks ago. The Aleppo mosque, the Umayyad Mosque of Aleppo, actually houses the remains of Zechariah, the same Zechariah in the Bible. Remember, he's revered by Christians and Muslims. If you don't know who Zechariah is, how ironic, here's the Muslim teaching you Christianity at a Catholic school. Zechariah was father of John the Baptist. John the Baptist would be decapitated. Where is his head? It's at the Umayyad Mosque of Damascus. Okay. You have 2 mosques. The third mosque is basically built by one of the earliest Syrian refugees in history. The dynasty that built this mosque, the Umayyad dynasty that fled to Spain, was fleeing a regime change in Damascus. Okay. We're talking about around the year 750. And that regime change is just another lesson in this story that we're telling of Syria. The Abbasid dynasty took over, and the last remaining member of the Umayyad dynasty fled all the way to Spain. Okay. I don't think it's as far as fleeing to Moscow as what happened in the most recent change in dynasty in Syria. This alternating red and white design, or sometimes alternating white and black design. If you've gone to Tuscany, and if you've seen any of the Tuscan churches, Leaning Tower of Pisa, the Cathedral of Siena, both of these are alternating designs coming from Syria. So I begin with one of my favorite Syrian poets, Nizar Qabbani. He's passed away, but what does he write? In the narrow streets of Cordoba, I reached into my pockets more than once to pull out the keys to our house in Damascus. Okay. So here we're having a Syrian more or less calling out the historical relations between Syria and Spain. Okay. Cordoba, Granada, Sevilla, these are all the historical legacy of a Muslim dynasty that came from Syria, moved to Spain, and here we're commemorating it. Before I begin any further with the toll that the Syrian civil war has taken, if I could just ask for a minute of silence, and this is just for everyone who has been consumed by the recent conflicts in the Middle East. If you don't mind, the picture I show who I am thinking of right now is this cat I met, not in Syria, but in Baalbek, not too far away, in ancient Roman ruins. So if I could just ask for a minute, please. Okay, thank you. Very good. It's March 14th, 2012. The Syrian civil war is close barely a year into this. This is an article I took from The Onion. And this begins our history, the alien world to help out Syria since this one refuses to. Sources from Zarklom 12 say they've watched human inaction to the Syrian crisis with shock and alarm over the 7,500 civilian casualties. Okay. Here we are more than a decade later. That inaction continued. Of course, the fatalities, we probably will never get a good estimate. But just, I use this as a historical source to show you what happened because of inaction. They're definitely, I mean, close to about 500,000. If we count the death toll of ISIS, this shows you kind of as a historical source when intervention could have happened. Okay, some kind of intervention. At this time, it was 7,500 fatalities. So I begin and I tell a story, and the story I begin is July 2012. Why was there little inaction? You have to realize in the summer of 2012, the international community, most policymakers, thought that the government in Syria, the regime, was done for. There were plans for a post-Assad government in place. There was a group called the Friends of Syria, assuming that the Assad regime would fall at any moment. I showed this graphic from The Guardian because it has a specific date, July 2012. That's the date where I made a presentation in Lisbon at the NATO Generals College. And remember what had just happened. NATO intervened on behalf of the Libyan rebels. It was the NATO intervention that was justified by UN Security Council Resolution 1973 that gave the cover for NATO to provide air support for the rebels to move into Tripoli, even with the NATO air support. It took a while for the rebels to overthrow Tripoli. Now, I'm bringing up Tripoli because it's a good case to analyze what could happen in Syria's future. Russia had learned its lesson. UN Security Council 1973 passed because Russia really thought that this was an application of responsibility to protect, R2P. And a civilian massacre would ensue in Benghazi. The UN Security Council resolution intervened to prevent that, giving the international legal cover for NATO air forces to prevent that from happening. Okay. Russia was quite upset that that UN Security Council resolution became a smokescreen for regime change. And thus, NATO forces would not get another UN Security Council resolution to intervene on behalf of Syria, but nevertheless, the NATO generals that were present, who I am lecturing, were jubilant, assuming that the Syrian government would fall in any month. What did I tell career military officers at this point is simply look at this map, and I'm sorry, this graphic, and I can tell you based on this graphic, the Syrian government is not going to fall. Okay. Not anytime soon. I told them I might not gain control of the country, but this is all the Syrian government has to do. As long as it can hold on to Damascus and a coastal road, the government in the Middle East is basically the capital city. Okay. And I said, it's basically this. Okay. It's basically this. Look at this disparity. Look how many aircraft one side has. Look how many tanks the other side has. Okay. There is no way any rebel army can make an offensive into the capital and overcome this disparity of tanks, more than 4,000 to 1,400. More than 71 helicopters, 550 aircraft. In other words, you can have as many defections as possible from the regular Syrian military, okay? As long as this disparity is not overcome, okay? The Syrian government is not going to fall. That was the prediction I made in 2012. It doesn't necessarily mean the Syrian government could go on the offensive, but it was not going to fall. This is what I did tell the people present there. It's the following. This military force was developed in terms, now we're going from the multilateral to the bilateral, for the Syrian state to maintain strategic parity with Israel. The numbers you see here are a result of Egypt signing a separate peace with Israel in 1979. Syria is the last remaining frontline state with Israel, and more or less tried to match its military, okay, to Israel's strength. And this is what I argued. A military force that was designed to achieve strategic parity with Israel is going to be unleashed against its own population, and it's going to be a massacre. It's going to be a bloodbath. These are tanks that are supposed to battle other tanks, okay? What's happening is the tanks, instead of going into battle, turn their turrets against towns and cities, helicopters, even ballistic missiles that are technically supposed to go into space and land back on the Earth's surface are going to be used against Syria's own people. And that was the outcome. Okay. A mass mobilization military meant for a conventional war with Israel. That war never materialized. What did materialize was this entire arsenal unleashed against Syria's civilian population. After giving that lecture, it's 2013. Okay. And again, just speaking of now, I just gave you an overview of the military dynamics. I want to give you an overview of some personal stories. Father Paolo Dall'Olio was an Italian priest who set up a monastery in Syria. It was a site of interfaith healing. It was a site revered by both Christians and Muslims, and that was the goal. In fact, the book of his, I think I do have it here. Yeah, A Church of Islam, right here, was about the life of Father Paolo Dall'Olio. In 2013, he was kidnapped. His fate to this day is uncertain. He made both an enemy of the government as well as ISIS. I remember, and this is kind of the story of how long I've been lecturing about the Syrian conflict. I was asking the audience, telling the audience, asking the audience to keep him in their prayers, exactly on the same stage, exactly more than 10 years ago, 2013. I can't believe I was on this stage telling people, you can see because the screenshot is really old. I have a tab for TV Guide. Who uses TV Guide anymore? Okay, that's how long. Dera Musa, Mar Musa was his monastery. Yeah, his remains, his fate still remains unknown. That was in 2013. Why was I giving a lecture here in 2013? The US was about to bomb Syria for its use of chemical weapons. Remember what I said. What you don't see here are the chemical weapons. Again, when Syria was trying to achieve strategic parity with Israel, chemical weapons were one of the ways of matching Israel's nuclear program. And in 2013, a deadly nerve agent attack occurred on the outskirts of Damascus in Ghouta. And this case is hard to imagine. What averted that airstrike was, again, hard to fathom. Russia working in tandem with the US. Russia promising we will ensure Syria dismantles its weapons of mass destruction program, and then Vice President Biden acquiescing to that plan. So I begin with the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War witnessed a dynamic that would continue into the Syrian Civil War. For the first time, these were civilian airliners. For the first time in history, civilian airliners were retrofitted with bomb bay doors. You see, the passenger windows are still there. And something revolutionary happened over the town of Guernica in the Basque Country of Spain. For the first time, bombs were dropped on the civilian population. Okay. It was a rehearsal for World War II. Guernica occurred in 1937. Okay. Who would have thought by 1945 the dynamic would transform, where a plane would have the same design, except of dropping a bunch of bombs, all it took was a single bomb to obliterate an urban center. Of course, I'm talking about the first use of the atomic bomb over Hiroshima. Okay. For the Spanish nationalist forces, this was the air force provided by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy that made the difference in the Spanish Civil War. For Syria, it was 2015 when the Russian Air Force intervened. Okay. Like I said, the Syrians could hold the capital. They weren't able to retake the rest of the country until the Russian intervention. And what we see for the first time is a foreign air force being invited into the Middle East and turning the tide of the Civil War. How many Russian aircraft did it take to break the stalemate in the Civil War by 2015? 34. That's all it took. 34 Russian aircraft, and it turned the tide of the entire Civil War. You can get an idea of Russia's confidence going into Ukraine. Everyone thought the Russian deployment into Syria would be a quagmire. In fact, it saved the Assad government, but you could also have to understand a lot of these aircrafts, as well as the weapons, were more or less a rehearsal, just as the Luftwaffe of Nazi Germany used Guernica, the Spanish Civil War, as a rehearsal for World War II. It absolutely again happened in the skies of Syria. The Russian deployment to Syria was a rehearsal for the invasion of Ukraine. So many new weapons, whether it was ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, stealth fighters, had their first deployment over the skies of Syria. And the horror of this bombing of the air, I want you to see how it's replicated, how it's reflected in Guernica. So let's break down Guernica. And for those of you going to Spain with me, you'll get to see this painting live in the Reina Sofia Museum. Picasso was living in France when he got the news in the newspaper of the bombing of Guernica. Remember, he would have read about it in a black and white newspaper. Okay. That explains, it's through the mass media. I want you to think of kind of this pivot, this inflection point in modernity. It's through the mass media where Guernica got Picasso got the shock. What is Picasso doing? You think, why did he not choose to paint this in color? He wanted to reflect the effect reading a mass circulation newspaper had on him. The alternating gray, white, black patterns, this is all a reflection of reading the news of Guernica in the newspaper. So let's break it down. Look at the faces contorted looking at the sky above, because what is Picasso trying to capture? This is really the first time where mass destruction came from the sky above. Sure, there were Zeppelins being used during World War I, but this was something entirely different. I want you to think of it, a plane that traveled mass distances, okay, carrying bombs, weapons of mass destruction, deliberately targeted the masses. Okay. And in this painting, what is he trying to communicate? That novelty, hence, of seeing death from above. Because if you think from the history of political violence, death usually came from the horizon. Usually it was the army besieging the city walls or a foreign navy entering the bay and bombarding your city. Okay. This is indicating the novelty. And remember, this was a painting meant for the masses. It was for the Republican side in the Paris Pavilion. The Republican side now, in this painting, right? It is actually massive. Actually, this is a perfect size. It's almost a perfect replica of how big Guernica was. It was meant for public exposition. This is public art. This is art for the masses. And if you'll notice something here, the horseshoe in the shape of a crescent. This was Picasso's way of objecting to the foreign fighters Francisco Franco used during the Spanish Civil War. The horseshoe in the shape of a crescent, referring to the Muslim Moroccans of Franco's Army of Africa. That was his way of objecting of how this side had to import foreign soldiers to put down a Spanish, basically who was a just Spanish cause. Okay. Now, there is a reason, let's go back to the multilateral, that there's a replica of Guernica, okay, at the United Nations General Assembly. All world leaders usually field questions in front of this because as a multilateral body, now this was actually, it's a simulacrum of Guernica. Okay, it's not the real thing. For most of history, Picasso would not let Guernica be shown until Spain, until the Franco government basically stepped down. It was a commission actually sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation. He sponsored this for the UN General Assembly, as well as a mural in his headquarters by Diego Rivera that he eventually had to rescind, but this one is still there. In 2003, Colin Powell refused to take questions in front of this replica. Why is this in the UN General Assembly? It is basically a reminder, as a multilateral body, we will never let Guernicas happen again. And sure enough, Guernicas happened in 2003. Okay. And they happened in 2016. This is Aleppo-Nika. Okay. It's by a Portuguese graphic artist in this case, not Spanish, Portuguese. And now, do you see how he changes the dynamics, right? Death continues to rain from above. These are supposed to be Russian aircraft. Here we see the bull in the shape of Vladimir Putin. Here we see Obama, okay, really not doing anything. Okay. This is Bashar al-Assad of Syria. Here are refugees fleeing to the European Union. And here's what I argue is one of the first cyborgs to plague the Middle East, the terror-suicide bomber. If you think, what is a cyborg? It's a cybernetic organism. And what I argue is the minute explosives were fused with the human body, you had a new type of cyborg ravaging the Middle East. This is a reference to ISIS. This is Aleppo-Nika. And this was the argument in 2016. Guernica was happening again. Okay. We tend to forget, what are some dynamics to civil wars? That female combatants are mobilized. This was, Marina was even if we could use the word back then, a viral sensation. Okay. Not only did we have, she was of course being mobilized on the Republican side in Barcelona. Okay. And so too, we've had the same dynamic in the Syrian civil war. Here's a female combatant manning, and poor choice of words, commanding an anti-aircraft gun. And here's that little pasty boy that people were going crazy over in 22. Our little vampire friend. Okay. It's quite amazing. I just noticed that. Okay. At the same time, we had in a corner of Syria something that appropriated, okay, the Republic of Gilead in Margaret Atwood's dystopian novel. Okay. The Islamic State. You see here, this is not only a billboard of how women are supposed to dress, but I would argue every woman in Syria and the area that ISIS controlled also became billboards of the Islamic State. Every woman that was more or less dressing like this, and remember, like, for Syria, it was one of the most secular countries in the history of the Middle East. This garb was very foreign to Syria, you have to understand. Okay. And again, just with female combatants, you had the rise of Kurdish female militants in this case, symbolically destroying. How did you destroy the power of the Islamic State? By, even if the ISIS fighters had withdrawn, you destroyed their billboards. What's another dynamic? The foreign indifference. So now remember, this political cartoon would be more or less a reference to, at that time, would have been the League of Nations. So here is army fascism referring to the Franco side, democracy referring to the Republican side in Spain. This is, of course, a reference to Mussolini, the Fascist International, and this would be the British and French, more or less saying, hey, I say fair play. You shouldn't encourage the aggressor, you know. After all, my friend and I aren't trying to help his victim. You have that political cartoon, which I juxtapose with this Facebook image. Again, of the indifference to the suffering in Syria. And again, it's also a reflection when most of the world used Facebook. This is around 2012 when I captured this image. Okay. And then you had independent foreign volunteers. And the one I want to show you is actually somebody who took part in fighting on the Republican side, beginning in Barcelona with a Trotskyist militia. It's this tall, lanky figure here. Does anyone recognize him? That's George Orwell. Okay. Of course, George Orwell he fought in the Spanish Civil War. Homage to Catalonia was about his experience. He would what would be called a foreign fighter. He would be what we call a foreign fighter. Fighting on the Trotskyist sides, eventually fighting in Barcelona. This is not too far. Rebecca, this is, I'll say, I think Campo de, where was this battle? The big campo outside of Madrid. Yeah, Casa de Campo. This is where he was stationed at this moment. Okay. Now, I juxtapose Orwell. So you have to think 1984, Animal Farm. All of these works are being experienced by his time fighting. Remember, what undermined the Republican cause was infighting when the Stalinist militia tried to consolidate the rebel movement. Okay. And I argue the Stalinists were a bit like ISIS. ISIS was technically a rebel faction that tried to consolidate the rebel movement and ended up eliminating all of them. Okay, from Orwell, the most eloquent writer of our times, giving us a manual on how to use the English language. Let's look at some of the foreign fighters in Syria. Here we go.
Hey, we still right here, homie. It's fucking morning. Fucking.
We got the enemigas right there, homie. Let me represent myself, homie. It's Creeper, homie, from the G-Dub 13 gang, homie. Sun Valley gang, homie.
It's fucking Weiner from Westside Armenian Power Gang, homie.
Still Puro Sureños putting it
Right
down,
here,
homie.
homie.
And Middle East, homie, in Syria, still gangbanging, not giving
That's
a fuck.
two LA gangbangers fighting in Syria. They're thought to be two members of the Armenian Power Gang and also reference Sir 13, who have a presence in Los Angeles. The two men go by the names of Wino and Creeper, and at first we thought it seemed so odd that it might be fake.
As you know, homie, and shout out, homie, Capone, Mr. Criminal from Silver Lake, homie, Capone from Cyclones, and Crazy Loco from Pasadena, and Pink Lady. We still got love for you, girl. We still got love for
But here's a couple of reasons why we're now pretty convinced that it's real. The video was posted first to one of the men's Facebook pages, a man called Nurses Kalajian, but it was later deleted. Since then, it's been reposted online, obviously, going to prove once again that one does not simply remove something from the internet. Also on his Facebook page are a picture of a tattoo linking him to the same LA-based Armenian gang. There are also images of him posing with pro-government fighters, and he's checked into areas in and around Aleppo on a few occasions recently, although there's nothing in this video to conclusively say that it was shot in Aleppo.
In Syria, homie. We're in Syria, homie.
Still G-Dub Gompiwanos 13 gang, homie.
Frontline, homie.
Puro
Frontline,
HG,
homie.
We'll leave you to listen into some more of the videos now, homies. Oh God. But thanks to Nick from 101 London Museums for suggesting the video. There's a link to his blog in the video description.
That's right. Got
That's
love
how we
for
do
all
it,
the
homie.
Sureños, homie.
That's
Mr.
how we
Criminal,
do it,
put
dog.
that all the fucking songs, homie. You're the shit, homie.
That's how we do it,
And
dog.
Syria gangbanging. Look at this fucking rain, homie. Fuck them.
We're in the fucking front line, homie. Front fucking line, homie. We
Turn
don't
that
give a
shit off,
fuck,
homie.
dog.
Turn that shit off, homie.
Okay, now, what's happening there is the following. There are a good number of Armenians. Oh, no. Okay, hold on. I think I found the right presenter view. Okay, there are a good number of Armenians who were dispossessed from the Anatolian Peninsula during World War I, ending up in Syria and Lebanon. Okay, and then from there, going even further afield to Pasadena, the Valley, Glendale, or Mendale as it's known. Okay, so it's not surprising that where you have one of the largest concentrations of the Armenian diaspora, that a good number of Armenians might basically get involved in gangs and pick up the kind of, let's say, gang lingo. If there are a good number of Armenians in Syria, okay, basically the Syrian government, more or less, instead of sold, and I'm saying this literally, sold its defense of the nation in terms of we are protecting the nation's minorities, particularly Christians, from the jihadist elements that included ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda faction, that would later evolve to the Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, the largest rebel faction that really was at the forefront of the lightning assault over the last couple of weekends. That's how the Syrian state kind of sold their defense. And so it's not surprising that if you have a good number of Armenians trying to defend Armenians in Syria, that they would go all the way from Glendale and are on the front lines in Aleppo. Here is another foreign fighter. This is in 2013. It's again this summer at John Cabot University. My students told me the case of this person. The father of Giuliano Del Novo, my son, died a hero for saving his friend. What's the story of Giuliano? He would be like Orwell. Okay. You see, when my students ask me, and this is a class I teach, they're called Italy and the Middle East, did you hear about the case of Giuliano? I said, no. And so what I'm recreating was I went to this news site and back again, remember, this is a history of social media as well. I knew something, everyone back in those days had a Facebook account. So I said, his physical body is dead, but I'm pretty sure his cyber persona is still alive. And sure enough, it was. And what I did in that classroom in 2013 is literally what I'm doing with you. I did a digital autopsy based on his Facebook page. I didn't even have to read this. I knew how he died. The last profile picture he put was the flag of ISIS, you see. Okay. So I've talked about now a couple of, we go from Orwell to those fighting for the government side and those hypothetically fighting against the government side. What's the story of Giuliano? Okay. Well, I go back in reverse and I could say, okay, that was his last, he was inspired by the Russian Chechens, the Muslim Chechens fighting against the Russians. Here's the flag of ISIS. But for all intents and purposes, this was also just a young man who would have liked films you might like, such as Lord of War, Carlito's Way, some Italian films. That's the flag of ISIS. This is a quote in Italian by Sayyid Qutb. In 1964, Sayyid Qutb published a book called Milestones. That was the manifesto, the birth of the jihadist movement, of the use of Islam and violence. Jihad, as you know it, was really not born in Muhammad's lifetime. It was born in 1964, the first violent Islamist manifesto. And he's quoting from it in Italian. That's Sayyid Qutb. Abdullah Azzam was a follower of Sayyid Qutb, and he would go on to mentor two people. The first is a Yemeni who moved to Saudi Arabia. You know him as Osama bin Laden, and an Egyptian surgeon named Ayman al-Zawahiri. So here's Del Nevo calling Azzam a hero. But I'm also looking at this. So what can I tell? He comes from Genoa. Okay, he comes from Genoa. And he felt solidarity for the Muslim people. And here he's liking a mosque in Europe, okay? And more or less I could read here. Okay, I'm reading here. Most likely, they'll never find Islam through a lot of, let's say, virtual sites. But let's keep on going. This is Anwar al-Awlaqi, a Yemeni American that was assassinated by our government by a drone. Nevertheless, the ideologue between Al-Qaeda's branch in Yemen. Here is somebody who liked the kind of the Islamic circle of the Republic. So he felt solidarity with the Palestinian people. Here he's liking Osama bin Laden and Che Guevara, not necessarily an Islamist image, but an anti-hegemonic one, we can say. That's the original image. I hunted it down, which is kind of ironic. I don't know if the graffiti artist really thought, why is this guy here and then an American bald eagle? But anyway, and here's fascinating. This is Omar Mukhtar. Omar Mukhtar is, now this is, was a Libyan tribal leader who fought Mussolini's army for more than a decade. Mussolini could not defeat the Libyan army of Omar Mukhtar until he introduced chemical weapons into Libya. What's fascinating about this is what ISIS does. ISIS was able to get people to not only reconfigure their identity, but reconfiguring their identity by lashing out at the country from which they came from. In this case, hypothetically, Omar Mukhtar might have killed Giuliano's relatives, the conscripts who were sent to Libya. That doesn't matter because with the reconfiguration of his identity, he feels more affinity with Omar Mukhtar than his Italian self. And this became kind of what I argue through a Facebook image. It's a form of asymmetrical power that ISIS had. The ability to overcome the sovereignty of nations, particularly in Europe and the US. Remember, when so-called lone wolf actors, they were never really lone wolves. attacks, such as the San Bernardino attacks, which you probably don't remember, or the attack against a gay nightclub in Orlando. What did the assailants do? They declared their allegiance to ISIS on Facebook. Okay. This is something I don't think Zuckerberg could have ever anticipated. Okay. Creating the means for individuals who are mostly, you can see, I would argue, they probably were indoctrinated. It wasn't any time just the lone wolf, okay, through Facebook. And then we keep on going. And this is what I'm saying. This is an evolution because earlier he liked a picture of Sheikh Kabani. Okay, I already told you the last name, Kabani, the Syrian poet. Sheikh Kabani was a Sufi, you see. This is the most moderate spiritual form of Islam. It's actually the antithesis of the jihadist, and I'm introducing a new word to you, Salafi strand that Al-Qaeda and ISIS represents. It is the antithesis. In other words, in 2011, in October, he was basically telling the world, hello, my name is Ibrahim, which I don't know why he chose that name. This is a pain in the ass. Excuse me. It's long-ass names. Forgive me. It gave me hell growing up. Of course, because if you're a foreigner in third grade in the US, what do the kids remind you of? Oh, look what's in your name. Oh, okay. So I don't, of course, I was traumatized by this thing, but he chose it. I had no choice. By the way, if you don't know Ibrahim, Arabic for Abraham, he chose that name. So in other words, basically what did he say? He had converted to Islam. And you have to understand, ISIS preyed upon more or less three demographics in Europe. The first one was usually kids of the second generation of Muslims. Okay. Why second generations? The first generation of Muslims that would have come to Europe, let's say from North Africa to France, from Algeria to France, or from Morocco to Spain, these are people who risked everything to create a new life for their kids. Okay. The message of ISIS never had any appeal to them. Okay. It's the second generation that represented this kind of liminality. And what do I mean by liminality? It's this. They're born, let's say in Spain or France. Okay. They don't know the home country, but they haven't quite fit into the new country that they're born in. Okay. So this is the case of, let's say, Moroccans born in Spain, Algerians born in France. And usually they're the son of immigrants or daughters in some cases. Okay, so they're not living the best socioeconomic statuses. So you're talking about the poor, the ghettos of Paris or Barcelona. So they've lived in poor socioeconomic conditions. And usually their homes weren't that religious, you see. Religion, Islam for them was maybe going to mosque on the Eid, but that's about it. And a good number of them would find a life of petty crime and end up in jail. And it was usually in jail that they became reborn Muslims. And usually it's in the conditions of incarceration that the kind of Islam that ISIS spreads flourishes in a jail. And upon their release, they revolt against their parents and their home country. I'm going to be more Muslim than you are. I was in jail, they argue, because you never taught me the proper form of Islam. But I'm also going to revolt against the country I was born in. Okay. That was the first demographic that ISIS preyed upon. If you're a third generation, okay, by that time you're so integrated in the country, again, the message of ISIS never had an appeal. And converts to Islam. Okay. Now we're talking about a small percentage. Small percentage of European converts to Islam are usually disowned from their families. And when they're disowned from their families, they're looking for new ones. And a lot of times the converts to Islam will find a new family at the Islamic Center. But there's always that small amount that want to even prove themselves more Muslim than their Muslim friends. And that's the small amount that gravitates towards ISIS. But do you see, there's nothing inevitable. It's a gradual process in the story of Giuliano del Nevo. And again, if you see, this is a video game figure. And right here, what was happening around 2012? He was watching news from Syria. He was watching, now as a Muslim, he's saying, the people I see on the screen are people I identify with. They're my fellow Muslims, and the world is not doing anything. Remember, April 2012, that was about the figure of 7,500. And then he was born, you see? But if we do this in reverse, it becomes a reverse autopsy from his birth to his conversion to Islam, And then evolving. There's nothing about Umar Mukhtar that's necessarily radical. It starts with gravitating towards Al Qaeda and the breakaway faction from Al Qaeda, ISIS. And so, sure enough, he died in the soil of Syria in 2013. This is the story of foreign fighters. And now the story of refugees. Okay. The story of refugees. I begin it with the following. Let's watch the following image. I'm sorry, the following video. It's 2016. The town of Homs has been quote unquote liberated. Remember all those military assets I was talking about when I said they got unleashed on the Syrian urban centers? This is what it looked like. This is a Russian drone company filming the aftermath of the Battle of Homs. Look at those three kids. This is what struck me. Now you could understand what caused the refugee crisis. There is literally nowhere for you in this place. And to this day, I still think of those three boys. Okay. I compare the refugee crisis. Oh, okay. Let me just fix this again. Again, going back to the Syrian, refugee crises of the Spanish Civil War. Okay, this is the border between Spain and France as the nationalist side was scoring victory after victory. Okay, and I juxtapose that with this image here, the images of Syrian refugees that were mobilized for the Brexit vote, leave the European Union on 23rd of June. Okay. And with that, I go to this image. Okay. Here we are, it's the 20th of June, 2019, where I'm going to an event hosted by Amnesty International in Rome. This is a boat of refugees, some Syrian, some Libyan, some African, right? And here is the image of the helicopter that was flying over them, and then started to ask the question, where are you now? And I took this picture, and this is just a little baby who was sitting in front of me as I watched this movie. And I was just quite impressed how this family, came to see this film about refugees, a good number of them Syrian, even brought their baby along. Okay, because of course, the most iconic image of the Syrian refugee crisis was Aylan Kurdi, okay? A young boy who didn't make it on those overcrowded dinghies leaving the coast of Turkey, trying to reach the islands of Greece, particularly Mytilene, one of the closest islands to the Greek shore, of course, Mytilene, otherwise known as Lesbos, the borders of the European Union. Okay. And I juxtapose that boy with this boy, Muhammad. Okay. Who is Muhammad? Muhammad was I'm guessing he's about 7 years old. And there was a program at City Heights where you could go volunteer to help refugees. Now, it's any refugees. They could be refugees, Somali refugees. When I arrived, the organizers said, "Can you handle a bit of a wild boy?" And they were referring to Muhammad. He didn't speak a word of English. They told me not to speak Arabic with them, but I did anyway. He would have come from an area close to Raqqa. Now, Raqqa, I'll talk to about later. But this is the work I did. Now, of course, when we came, I mean, you have to understand most of the volunteers here, and now we're getting kind of a bit partisan, if you don't mind. A large number of volunteers suddenly increased after Trump's travel ban, the so-called Muslim ban. Then that did wonders for the volunteers. And going into a second Trump administration, again, not to be partisan, but one thing that, a good number of us had to admit in the San Diego area, it did wonders for creating a kind of civil society in San Diego. The amounts of volunteers that were coming out to do these kind of initiatives doubled. In fact, I even met a British student from UCSD who had to take 3 buses to get to City Heights just to help and tutor the refugees. From that point onwards, I gave her rides back and forth to UCSD. But I'll never forget that day with Muhammad. So it must have been the 6th of March. Prior to doing, this was our final project. But what were we doing beforehand? So you have to remember, I'm just sitting with this boy, playing on the floor with him. We built a house of bricks. Toy bricks, Lego bricks. And after we built it, he says, "Okay, this is great. Now let's destroy it like they destroyed my house in Syria." Okay. And I said, "No, no, no, your house won't be destroyed. This house here is safe." And now what did I have to tell the staff? I said, "Please don't allow him, don't make him clean up his toy house. Let that toy house stand." Okay. And I'll never forget, I walked him over to his father who picked him up. And his father said, "Muhammad just had a baby brother who was just born a few hours ago, born in the US." Okay. And I think of where is Muhammad now? It's 2017. Where is that boy that was born in 2017? I tell that story because, of course, this was one child who never was able to get that new life. This was one who did, a young Syrian child who did. Now, here we go to my first job was with an NGO called CSI. Not what you're thinking. I wish. CSI stands for Child Soldiers International, not Crime Scenes Investigations. Now I show you the following. It's 2014 when I show you this video. Where is this? Now you have to realize a good number of the people you're seeing here would evolve into Syria's main rebel faction. Okay. They began as a branch of Al-Qaeda. And again, if you just talk about kind of the, how history churns in a different direction, this is, I'm going to show you a couple of videos about child soldiers in Syria.
وبدأنا الحمد لله رب العالمين بتشكيل جمع جديد وأسمنا على اسم أخونا الشيخ أسامة بن لادن، نسأل الله أنه يتقبله في الشهداء. جبهة بن لادن لتحرير الشام. حياك يا أبو عمر.
So Tahrir al-Sham, the liberation of Syria, the name of the the main Syrian faction is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. I mean, but you have to understand, this is where it originally came from.
عملت رياضة؟
الحمد لله.
عملت درس عسكرية؟
وبعدها قرأنا القرآن.
مستعد أن تخرج الآن للقتال في أي مكان في بقاع العرب؟
إن شاء الله. أنا اسمي أبو عمرو، عمري 13 سنة، من جبهة بن لادن. خرجت لتحكيم كتاب الله في الأرض والدفاع عن المظلومين في سوريا. أسأل الله أن يرزقنا الشهادة. نحن جندك يا أسامة.
نحن جندك يا أسامة.
نحن طلاب شهادة.
نحن طلاب شهادة.
دربنا درب منير.
دربنا درب منير.
Many teenage boys have joined the ranks of the jihadist units fighting Assad. Hassan, now called Abu Ali, is one of them. Now he prepares
This is the one I think about. Remember, I've been giving this lecture, I've been talking about this lecture for more than a decade. It's these kids that, when I was watching the news on Saturday, that I was wondering.
Prepares to head to the front line for the first time.
جيب لك هيدي رايك لا اله الا الله. ايه جيبها. لا وين بدي احطها؟ على راسك. حطها هيك.
لا اله الا الله. And you got to understand, there's like something, a set of semiotics that are going here, on here. Remember I said Syria was, for most of its history, quite a secular country. The way they're growing their beards, the way they're dressing, this is all kind of symbolism of them turning towards the more Salafi interpretation of Islam. It's, again, just so you know, it's something that was, it's not something indigenous to Syria.
وين ديروا فيهم؟ وين ديروا فيهم يعني؟ نلعب فيهم. هذول نستشهد ان شاء الله، نتصل بعدين نستشهد. مو؟ لا لأنه نتصل بعدين نستشهد. مو؟ لا ايه؟ ما صرنا عنا واحنا بالي. شو؟ ما صرنا عنا واحنا بالي. أول ثورة أول ما بلشت.
This is the hard thing because you actually saw my sister and her child just a few minutes, when we began here. And this girl reminds me so much of my youngest sister. I could tell you, I don't know what happened to this kid, but I'm pretty sure he didn't survive. And I'm just saying, I hope he did. But what I know is it's usually child soldiers. Particularly in the fighting for Aleppo, where the fighting was intense, and it's usually child soldiers are given the most dangerous missions to clear the way for the more professional seasoned soldiers. My question is this: even if I hope the girl survived, okay, it's 10 years now, right? And I would think if she lost her older brother. This was always something I would ask back in 2014. This girl, let's hope she grows up, but how would she ever reconcile herself with the state in Damascus if she lost her brother to it? Okay. And really, I got my answer this Saturday, was that there was probably a lot of cases like her, apparently, that never reconciled themselves with the government, with the state. And like he said, I was against the revolt in the beginning. It was the state's heavy-handed response that churned him. So, I show this image. Okay. The first victim of a child soldier is, a child, because, when I was working for this NGO, I was arguing in a lot of ways, a child soldier is like a drone. It takes the more experienced soldier, gives them a distance from the battlefield, right? And just like a drone, a child soldier is quote unquote easy to program. It's also one of the tragedies of the creation of the Kalashnikov rifle in 1947. It was so light and easy to use. It allowed children. That's when the phenomenon was really born. There's always been children in warfare, but the child soldier was really a byproduct of the creation of the Kalashnikov in 1947. Okay. Now, again, another sort of digital autopsy. These are women affiliated with ISIS. These are usually women who left. Like I said, let's go back to that second generation I told you about, who left the UK or other European states and actually moved to the Islamic State in Syria, particularly its capital called Damascus. In this case, I'm looking at a woman, her name is Osama. Okay. And notice what she puts as her profile picture. My husband's Kalashnikov, okay, my Kalashnikov, and my son's Kalashnikov, right? So what do I know about this woman? Not only does she have a son, okay, and you see here, this is 2015, right? It's been a year after the Islamic State has been declared, okay? But then she must also have a baby girl. because she puts that baby girl with that pistol right there. And you have to realize this is another generation. This child will be 9 years old if she is alive. And what I'm assuming right now is this girl and maybe her mother might be in a state of sort of limbo. There is a camp in the deserts of Syria housing maybe now up to this time around 60,000 captured ISIS families. Again, this is the other question. I'm not sure where how many of these kids are alive. And I use that because I juxtapose that against another ISIS image of this cat, where you have these ISIS fighters literally declaring an Islamic state of cat. Fetwa bint Usama does this to her daughter. Now, nowhere in Islamic theology does it ever say that a girl this young has to be veiled. We tried to bribe her with kittens and Nutella, but she went into for the AK. And what you see here is this kind of echo chamber. When we talk about social media and the echo chamber, there are people out there that like these images, right? This is in Arabic, again, just to show you across cultures. She's being sarcastic on Twitter. This is a little terrorist she's writing, being sarcastic, on the land of the caliphate. May make him a future soldier of the caliph. All of these kids are orphans. Okay. Becker Britannia is probably from the UK. And more or less, these are all kids who lost their dads. But she's saying, how glorious that each of these kids lost their dad. Okay. And then Abdul Latif, here's another one. Orphan, lost his father with the Kalashnikov. Imagine this. I had to put this together. Abdul Latif, this is the mom. This is her son. Basically, she's saying, I lost my husband. He lost his father. I hope my son grows up and gets a beautiful death like him. It takes a while when you collect these images to understand what's going on. But again, it's asking the question, where are these kids now? It's been 10 years later for a good number of them. Now, from that, we get to another great debate. Okay. A whole debate about how much of the Civil War was the product of political ecology, the state's mismanagement of water resources. So I'll go a bit quicker just to finish up and leave for questions. But what I want, so I'll just basically sum up the debate is more or less Syria, like at one time Uzbekistan, trying to be state sufficient and in the cultivation and export of cotton. Cotton is a very water intensive crop. And as a result of the state's mismanagement of water and aquifers, combined with a drought, you had a good number of displaced farmers. And a good number of those displaced farmers would pour into towns such as Raqqa. Now, the debate is this, okay. Prince Charles, this was the first time that, he's King Charles, okay. But he argued this is the first example of the confluence of climate and conflict. He was arguing this is the perfect example of how climate change will lead to conflicts in the future. The academic debate, of course, is saying it's much more complex, Mr. Charles, who was Prince back then. But nevertheless, what I want to do from this point is make a connection without going into the debate. One could not doubt that there were absolutely displaced farmers as a result of the drought and the state's political ecology, the mismanagement of water. We're seeing it throughout the Middle East. The same thing. So here's Raqqa on the Euphrates. Now, if we keep on going downstream, what happened? There was a different set of political ecology. Saddam Hussein, who himself was born on the Tigris in Tikrit, as leader of Iraq, deliberately drained the marshes of Iraq in 1991 to prevent a rebellion from using it as a base. Basically, you can't bring in tanks into marshy wetlands, and hence he deliberately drained it. And as a result of that act of political ecology, You had a good number of farmers living off the marshes. So this is basically mangroves. This is in terms of an ecological system, this is what prevents seawater from going upstreams when you have a good marshy wetland. A lot of farmers were displaced from the marshes after 1991. Now, the marshes were restored after 2003, but this is the thing. It's really hard to undo the damage one does to Mother Nature. The marshes were never restored to their pre-Saddam levels. Combined with rising temperatures, you had a good number of farmers and fishermen being displaced from their livelihood here, particularly around 2014. At the same time, when you had a lot of displaced farmers up the Euphrates, you had a militia. At the end of the day, let's just call it that for the sake of simplicity, called ISIS, saying we will now, they had just taken over Raqqa. You saw the billboards previously. We will give you a salary. And then sure enough, in 2014, they had this lightning assault, just like what we saw over the weekend, coming towards Baghdad, who offered a good number of the displaced farmers from the marshes a salary. The Iraqi Shia militias that mobilized to fight ISIS. And so what I'm saying here is hypothetically, and this has never been done as a proper study, it's just a hypothetical. It's basically two sets of literature that have never been combined. It's not hard to imagine that you would have displaced farmers fighting for ISIS, facing off displaced Shia farmers from downstream. Also displaced due to the confluence of political ecology as well as a changing climate. If you want to know what the temperatures are like here during this summer, I mean, these are anomalous weather events, 145 degrees in the summer. Last summer, the hottest temperature recorded on Earth, right around here. I mean, so there you go. And I highly recommend, if you want to study all the variables of this complex, why is it a complex debate about the relationship between the environment and conflict? Let's just take the one I just talked about. Wonderful website for your research. Right there, all the good conceptual models, good variables, history, well-sourced. That's what good German taxpayer money where it goes to. And I can't highly, I just love this. So much of my research is based on this set of data that's collected. So finally, let's conclude now. What does all of this mean for the region? All of these squares, and if any of you have, I guess, lectured for Randy's classes, you can see every single one of these squares is a conflict zone. But let's actually have time for questions. Basically, if we zoom out here without the borders, you can see that the other conflict that's happening in Ukraine isn't too far away from it. You probably have to understand Russian military planners, probably when they look at a map, they look at it with different angles that we would, okay? And this is now just an interesting dynamic. Russia and the Soviet Union for the longest time had their single military base. It was just a refueling station, but strategic nonetheless on the Syrian coast. So, of course, for those of you who probably don't know, I used to teach in Ukraine for the longest time. And you have to understand the Ukrainian media is now just exploding with wondering with the defeat in Syria. And this is what's fascinating, how a conflict in the Middle East is being, so closely analyzed in Ukraine, because now they're asking, what does this mean for Russian power? It made the difference in 2015, yet because of the war in Ukraine, so ago, they weren't able to prevent the fall of the House of Assad. Diana Dark has, if you're interested in art history, just two fascinating books. One is called Stealing from the Saracens. It's about how Gothic architecture owes everything to Syrian architectural designs. It's what I began my lecture with. She had a house in Damascus, imagining of Syria as it should be, stripped of the suffocating Assad regime, the faulty infrastructure, failing plumbing, wiring and drains turned out and discarded. Maybe I am a hopeless dreamer, somebody has to be. But I started with a Syrian poet. This is a British woman who lived in Syria. just so you know my background, I'm not from Syria. I'm from neighboring Iraq. So, I know Syria better than Iraq because I was exiled from Iraq because my dictator was Saddam, not Bashar al-Assad, which made it easier to go to Syria. So in Syria, I know both sides of this conflict. So not trying to be partisan, but just to show other voices in this. That's more than a decade of teaching the Syrian civil war. And like I said, I try to give you the stories of individuals that I'm wondering about. That's just through social media, but I actually know people on the ground. For those of you in my class, you'll hear some of those stories afterwards, the personal amount, but I leave it there. This is now the question in terms of Syria's future. What do I see? Countries like Yemen and Libya had their victorious moment. You had a dictator overthrown, only to witness the factions that overthrew the dictator. This is also fascinating. This is the other area I studied. The best year of my life was in Yemen. For them, it's not cotton that drained the aquifers, but a narcotic called khat that drained it. And if you went to my coffee lecture, you would understand how giving up coffee led to that. But this is the question. The militias could come together to overthrow a dictator in Libya and Yemen. And then what happens? Each militia creates their own warlord fiefdom. And then the war just keeps on continuing. And now this is the big question. Is the future of Syria like Yemen and Libya? Has it had enough violence? This is the longest war in the regions that there basically says enough, we'll find a way to work together. We're entering an unknown territory, but definitely a phase in my teaching career has come to an end. It began on this stage long ago, and hopefully it's going to churn. I have to be just a little bit optimistic for the better. Thank you. Thank you for bearing with me for this long journey. And now I open it up to questions. Okay, I'll start with you, Ryan, and then I'll work my way down.
A program like Rome, coming from a psychology perspective, that's like a very interesting approach because, obviously, the kids are very vulnerable. They don't really have an identity in life that's easy to exploit, as well as the fact that the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. So they're very easy to kind of exploit and weaponize, and like you said, they get put in dangerous missions, which, it's consistent with, the fact that they had gone for a fully developed prefrontal cortex. So that was a really interesting point you made. Aside from that, I'd be curious to hear the recent events in Syria. I'd be curious to hear your opinion on the Capricorn training, what that means.
Okay, two really important points. So the first one is, and this is what's and actually there might be a connection, and I'll put it this way. Besides kids being easy to program, you can give them easy incentives to fight. And one of them is this. You offer them drugs and alcohol. With the Lord's Resistance Army, that was it. You give them access to drugs. And this is tragic. And I warn you, this is triggering. You also tell these kids, go into that enemy village. And you could, there is a connection between the use of child soldiers and gender-based violence. Basically, the militia says you rape anyone you want. That's your reward. Particularly in the case with the Lord's Resistance Army, that was usually how you got child soldiers to fight. But there has been footage, and again, it's hard to verify this, of very young men who, it seemed like they were on some kind of drug like Captagon, fighting to the very end for ISIS. I mean, just young men who should have withdrawn from the building, but were obviously high and fighting to the very end. So Captagon, if you don't know it, that's a generic drug name like Tylenol. Syria, I would argue, is both a necro state and a narco state. What do I mean by necro state? I'm referring to Ashili Memembe's work, Necropolitics, where he basically looks at how states kind of condemn populations to slow deaths. And if you use Ashili's viewpoint, one could argue, yeah, that a good number of the country was just in such a state of poverty, they were being condemned to a slow death. Syria, on one level, was a necro state, and it was a narco state. It was making a lot of money off the trade of Captagon. This substance, thus making it a narco state as well. And this is a question. A good number of militias make their money some way or the other, whether selling bootleg oil, cigarettes, and it wouldn't be surprising that one of those militias would get into the Captagon trade. Now that the state might lose their monopoly on it, it could be. It could be a scenario. So I'm glad you asked that. And for the research you're doing for my class, that's something, if you do Captain, I'll say stick with the subject, because this is really the unhidden drug trade. I mean, the drug trade that rarely gets much attention paid to in the region. Really good question. Okay. Giovanna. Mm. It baffles the mind because I just want you to think of what's happened. Here you've had a country divided by civil war. And what unites a country more than a foreign country moving in and occupying your land? The leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, his last name is al-Jolani. He comes from the Golan Heights. So, I'm just thinking from an Israeli perspective, sure, it might be tempting, but at the same time, it might, and a lot of times Israeli land grabs usually backfire. Let's not forget when Israel stayed in the south of Lebanon as of 1982, it gave birth to Hezbollah. It was its decision to stay, there was no Hezbollah prior to 1982. So the easy way to answer this is, who knows what are the unintended questions? I'm just thinking from an Israeli perspective. Surely, haven't you learned your lesson from the past? And that, when usually you invade the south of Lebanon, it gets the people to rally behind a foreign foe. And surely that's what they're giving the Syrians. So that's all I could say. It baffles my mind why. Just from a strategic perspective, I'm talking about strategic, not tactical. I would just say, let the events in Syria unfold rather than becoming another player in this conflict. I'll work my way down, and then yes.
I was curious, what's Iran's reaction to all this, and is this going to have an effect on their influence in the region or their axis of resistance?
Yeah, absolutely. It's often said Iran is a great chess player in the region, but no, Iran has suffered a series of setbacks. It did not play the game, so to speak, metaphorically well after October 7th. And I'll put it this way. After October 7th, it could have easily pressured its proxies to say, Hamas conducted this attack. We had no indication of it. Let's sit it out. And it chose not to. And I'm saying the weakening of Hezbollah, the two air raids on Iranian sites, one probably a nuclear facility, and now losing Syria was a major blow. It was often said that Iran had two goals in the Arab Spring: take over Bahrain or Syria. It gave up Bahrain with a 70% Shia population because it realized Syria was a greater prize, and now it lost that. No, so Iran really did not. Well, now, this is also the other question that you have to ask. Having lost so spectacularly, is there now any reason why Iran would not go for a nuclear weapon? Just so you know, the science behind a final Iranian push for a nuclear weapon is, it's still not there. And there's still doubt scientifically. Does it have enough, centrifuges to get to that final creation of fissionable material, and then weaponizing it? That's a couple of years off. But if it ever did have an incentive, it's had it now. I'll put it to you, I'll give you the view on the street. A good number of Iranian Revolutionary Guards died fighting for Syria. A good number died. And I can't imagine the Revolutionary Guards as a corporate body being happy with the leadership for having lost Syria. This is what I'm thinking about, that it's not the president of Iran who just got elected, who really doesn't have a say on this. Ayatollah Khamenei really messed up. And this is my question. If the Revolutionary Guard were ever tempted to launch a coup, it would be around now. As a corporate military body, this is what you do when you lose faith in the guidance of your leader. It's a different regime, you know, than other military, I mean, Middle Eastern Arab regimes. But this is just what's going through. This is what keeps me up at night and where I can't sleep. Is just thinking of these scenarios.
Well, thank you for the presentation. I want to ask, so the interim president is there till March, right? And there is conversations about him being close to HTC.
The interim prime minister. Yeah, with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, yes.
Okay, 3 months is not that much of a time to make deals in a stable democracy, but in a place like Syria, I think this could make a lot of leeway for Turkey to make some deals that would benefit Turkey's sovereignty.
Yeah.
I think Erdogan will manage to be successful in doing that.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So Iran lost, Erdogan won. Erdogan played a long game. He basically, when these groups were cornered in Idlib, he told the Syrian government, you cannot touch that. You do not leave it up. This is, I mean, you remember Erdogan in 2011 imagined Egypt, who had just, you know, would elect the Muslim Brotherhood in 2012. Libya, he imagined all these states kind of imitating the AKP model, right? Of having, you know, kind of these Islamist democracies. That was his vision, and it took more than a decade. But no, definitely this is a win for Erdogan in Turkey. You know, he played the long game and it played off. Will Erdogan have influence? I would say HTS couldn't have won were it not without Turkish support. So definitely it's gonna, and they're gonna need one regional actor behind it. It's not Qatar. It's not going to be Saudi Arabia. It's going to be neighboring Turkey. So yeah, definitely this is a regional win for Erdogan, loss for Iran. Absolutely. Okay, tell me.
The Turkish operation going on in Horn of Africa, and since Russia will take a lot longer for Russia to go to Horn of Africa, I think they can't. They don't have the jet capacity to fly something from Ukraine to Yemen and go there.
Okay, really good question. So first of all, also just remember, this is a victory for Erdogan because never has he been in a better position now to deal with the Kurdish, with Rojava, the East. So, I mean, there's the ulterior motive, is he's always worried about that Kurdish statelet. For those of you who don't know, there is a contest over the Horn of Africa. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, all are vying for military bases, whether it's in Djibouti, some states saying we'll recognize Somaliland at the expense of Somalia. I mean, so let me put it this way. His first foreign adventure paid off. The UAE and Saudi Arabia never were able to dictate a complete success in Yemen. They tried, they invested, they gave up. The Houthis held their ground. I mean, Turkey does now have more wind. And if it sticks with its alliance with Qatar, to definitely shape the Horn of Africa. I mean, for all of Erdogan's detractors, now he finally says, okay, and for all of you going to Turkey, this is all things we're going to be looking at. So I'm so glad you asked. Yes, definitely. I mean, look, he's stuck behind the government of Tripoli. That paid off. He gave drones to the government of Tripoli. It was enough to stop the Russian-supported Eastern Libyan faction. He won Libya. He finally won Syria. So I'm sure he's invested a lot in Africa, not just the Horn of Africa. So yeah, I think he is on a roll. You have to give him that. Good question. Yes, Jennifer. That's really interesting. A lot of the reconstruction contracts were given to Russia, Iran, and I just wrote an article. A lot of the religious structures were rebuilt with aid from Chechnya. So if you don't know, there's a the links between, and this is what I kind of wanted to conclude with. The Turks call this Akdeniz, Karadeniz, the White Sea, the Black Sea, and the Red Sea, right? And I think the Turkish system says a lot, because basically what the Turks are saying is this is all an interconnected sphere. And nothing demonstrates that more than Yeah, or you have within the Russian Federation, Chechnya financing the reconstruction, but it's really Russian aid with a kind of Muslim laundering because Chechnya is a predominantly Muslim population. So yeah, you have a lot of Chechen aid going to Syria, Russian and Iranian. But remember, it was under sanctions. And that's why so many, it's funny, I would argue that two surprise outcomes came probably due to economics. Our election and what happened in Syria. Just the economic situation was so dire that it wasn't a final battle that gave the success to the rebels. It was more than a decade of sanctions. That's the conventional knowledge where the Syrians just finally said enough. At least with this new government, there's a hope of sanctions being lifted. But that's the reconstruction was slow and poor. And then, of course, Russia got consumed with Ukraine. And so it couldn't invest in the reconstruction. And then Iran started suffering. So it was stagnating situation. But no, most of those destroyed places really weren't getting rebuilt. Very good. Yes.
What do you think
Oh, that's the big question now. And it gets to the question of what would Turkey ultimately want. For the longest time, Turkey has been unhappy with that Kurdish statelet in the east of Syria, because number one, it was relatively well functioned. And that's a nightmare from the Turkish perspective to have a quasi-independent, well-functioning Kurdish state. Of course, it's going to be disruptive for Turkey's own Kurdish. So I ended my last article wondering about this, absolutely wondering about this. Is that going to be the next front line? And it could can they cut a deal with the central government? Can they cut a deal with Turkey? I really don't know. Yes. Absolutely.
What you think would happen if that becomes war? Like when Syria becomes like freedom of action, how do you think it would be if Russia had one?
You mean what would have happened if NATO intervened?
Yeah.
I mean, it could have just then become another Libya. Okay, yeah, it's an interesting counterfactual. I mean, if NATO had intervened, the Syrian uprising in the early stages was very different from what it is now. I mean, all of these groups I'm talking about, they emerged over time. The more, let's say, the original, I would argue, Syrian uprising was quite secular in nature. I mean, the hypothetical is this. If the Free Syrian Army would have won, the original Syrian army and its defectors, would it have ventured off and have all these kind of Salafist groups? Highly unlikely. I don't think so. The exiled Muslim Brotherhood of Syria was really trying to change things in Syria as of 2012. But I would argue a lot of this kind of, what you're saying is a hardline turn towards religion in Syria. It's born out of that just violence. That this austere form of Islam is a response to this just kind of the brutal naked violence that they had to endure. I have to argue it. And having traveled to Syria, like I said, it was a religious country, but a very also moderate and secular type of life as well. And they kind of coexisted, I would argue, at the end of the day. Yeah, a lot of what ifs. I have no idea. So I'm just guessing there, but yeah, definitely. I mean, even just in terms of humanitarian intervention, I mean, even with that, the way the refugees were kind of became politicized, that was, I think, the great tragedy.
Yeah. Thank you. And to take off of that last point, my question is about displacement. And if you have any predictions for future displacement, obviously, you said the kind of serendipity of the poster, the juxtaposition of the poster about Justin, and then a lot of those routes are closed.
Yeah.
And even a lot of the overland routes that popped up in 2015, 2016, those are either much more militarized than they were before, and usually even if you do make it to Europe, right, the likelihood of success is very, very low. So I wonder what you think about future movements, and then possibly about return. You know, you look somewhere like Germany, who gave a bunch of temporary visas, crossing their fingers, waiting for the Syrians to leave. Maybe they'll get their wish.
Well, I mean, all those applications paused on Monday. They stopped processing them, and it was just quite shocking and cynical. So let me I'll put it just what a lot of the Turks are saying, that there were so many Syrian refugees in Turkey, so many Turks blamed Erdogan for letting the problem fester, that this was one way Erdogan, this is the president of Turkey, by settling the Syria problem now, that the refugees basically have now no reason to stay in Turkey, that they can go home. This is one argument in terms of return, that the other motive was a very cynical way of getting rid of the Turkey's refugee problem. And if you know anything, so just so you know, 85% of the Syrian refugees were in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. 85%. All that furor in 2016, the Syrian refugee crisis was caused by 15% being distributed across the EU. Syrians, refugees in Lebanon are treated very poorly. So they're, without a doubt, they were the first to leave. So much as the border was like clogged. They're treated extremely poorly in Lebanon. Jordan just doesn't have much resources. Their conditions in the Jordanian refugee camps were, you know, they're living in more or less isolated deserts. So they are probably going to get relocated. But yes, so you have this, but then what you probably don't realize is how much internal IDP, and I would argue so much internal displacement is happening in Middle Eastern countries. And the case I'm looking at is primarily in Iraq because of changing climate conditions, particularly the fate of the Tigris and Euphrates. A lot of internal displacement is occurring. And this is the question, when will that eventually burst beyond Iraq's borders? This is the future. And so now you're saying, I mean, all these transit points, they're the same transit points, Iraq, Afghanistan. Turkey found a way to, you know, politicize now these refugees by basically cutting deals with the EU to control the flow. That's where, so maybe one refugee problem might be managed, and you have a good number of the European states basically saying, okay, now we're no longer under, but I'm saying, at least for Turkey, they might now finally say to all the Syrian refugees, okay, now you go home, only to have it replaced by another problem that Turkey is also kind of complicit in. Remember, the flow of the Tigris and Euphrates begins in Turkey. And so Iraq's survival is more or less contingent on Turkish hydropower. And so this is something I'm looking at. It's a problem that's brewing, but again, I'm doing a lot of counterfactuals. It's what ifs, but yeah, I found it quite interesting the way the various European states just literally on that Monday, you know, froze a lot of these applications. We'll wait and see. But I could just say from the Middle Eastern states where I study, yeah, definitely Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, the refugees are definitely going to start going back. And there's always a good reason. What happened to Iraq? They want to reclaim their home. That's what I remember in 2003, all of us were going back to Iraq to see what happened to our property. That's what's going to happen. And then let's see, God forbid, if more fighting comes, we could have another wave, God forbid. But that's also. Randy?
I have a couple of questions, but I think I'm going to save them for our adventure. I just want to say, like, if you get The Economist, all you get now is like the best books of the year and the best movies of the year, but your lectures are really the best of the year.
Oh, thank you.
Can't thank you enough for coming down and you leave such a great story. It's like from the geostrategic to the environmental to from poetry to Facebook.
Thank you.
Or whatever. It's just really fabulous, and I hope that the end of your semester here is really just the beginning of your relationship with USC.
Yes, I hope so too. It's been a great semester. I've had great students. Thank you.
Well, they don't have a lot of power. They have a little bit of authority in recruiting faculty And if you'd like to come back, we'd sure like to have
Yeah, oh,
you.
yeah, definitely. It's been a great
So anyway,
place.
we probably should let you get back to your students.
Yes.
But thank you so much for being part of our semester.
My pleasure. Thank you. All right, you gave me the invitation, so I owe this to you. So it's I'm just as grateful for you for having invited me. So kids, go back to our regular place. Megan, I know you had a question you could ask in class. So go ahead, for those of us in my class, take about 15 minutes to get settled back. And for the others, I'll see you in Madrid. Yeah, we'll be having tapas in a few weeks. And merhaba. Siz Türk müsünüz? Oh, merhaba.
Aksandan mı oldu?
Evet, evet.
I actually know you from Professor Greenwood because I was studying in San Marcos. He was my favorite professor. He actually recommended USD because he's a USD alum as well. Yeah, and also I transferred.
Oh, you transferred.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
I'm gonna be in Istanbul during the Istanbul trip too.
Oh,
And
excellent.
also I work at a corporate intelligence firm in Istanbul. It's US based firm.
Okay,
But
excellent.
we have like Ambassador Matthew Bryza is my current boss right now.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah,
So you
yeah.
ended up living in.
Yeah,
I knew him in the old days when he was the ambassador.
yeah,
Yeah,
I love
yeah, I
Matthew.
remember.
He's such a nice guy.
Oh, good for you.
And I have we're trying to talk with Professor Willoughby to arrange something where
That would be great.
we can
Yeah,
have everyone in the office and have a conversation.
I mean,